Hello, my name is Bryan. The day we buried my mother, I stood beside her coffin trying not to fall apart, when my father's mistress leaned in and whispered, like she'd already won, "Don't worry, dear. I'll spend the millions in your account far better than you ever did." I thought that was the cruelest thing I'd ever hear at a funeral. I was wrong, because a second later, my mother laughed from inside that coffin. And in that quiet church with everyone pretending not to notice, I realized something ugly. They weren't waiting for the service to end to take her place, or mine. So I had a choice: stay the quiet son they always underestimated, or finally become the man my mother trusted me to be. Savannah funerals aren't loud, they're careful. That afternoon at New Hope Baptist, the air held lilies and old wood, and stained glass laid soft color across my mother's face like a quilt. Her name was Margaret Peterson. People lined up with the same phrases. She was a blessing. She's at peace. Because silence makes folks uncomfortable. I stood near the open casket with my hands folded. I'm Bryan, 42, a CPA, the youngest kid, the one people call quiet, like it's something to fix. My father Scott worked the room like it was Sunday service, and he was on the deacon board. Firm handshakes, steady smile, eyes scanning for the next person who mattered. Grief sat on him like a suit. It covered everything. Before the service, I'd slipped into the church kitchen for a breath. By the coffee pot sat a small silver teaspoon, one of my mother's. She used it every morning for tea and honey. I don't know why I put it in my jacket pocket. Maybe I just couldn't stand leaving one more piece of her behind. I could hear her plain as day. Silver doesn't shout. It just lasts. Back in the sanctuary, I grabbed a funeral program to keep my hands busy. My sister's name was there. My father's name was there. The choir, the florist, the pallbearers. Then I found the family line. My name wasn't on it. At first I told myself it had to be a printing mistake. Then I remembered my father insisting on approving every detail to keep things dignified. Dignified. That word was his shield. Two women from my mother's prayer circle flipped through their programs. One of them paused, looked at me, and pressed her lips together like she wanted to speak but didn't know if she should. That old choice rose up in me. Say something and I'm making trouble. Stay quiet and I'm proving what they already believe. The youngest one doesn't count. People moved forward to say goodbye. Soft steps, murmured condolences. I stayed close, watching faces more than flowers. Then Jody Arias stepped up. My father's friend. That's what he called her in public. She wore a black dress that looked expensive without trying, pearls at her throat, hair perfect. She didn't belong that close to my mother, but she stood there anyway, perfume sliding into the space like it owned it. She glanced over her shoulder first, quick, measuring, then leaned toward the casket. I saw two of my mother's church sisters behind her. They saw it too. Jody lowered her mouth near my mother's ear and whispered, soft enough to feel private, "Don't worry, dear. I'll spend the millions in your account far better than you ever did." My chest went tight. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to pull her back by the elbow. I wanted to call her out so the whole church would turn and stare. But if I started something at my mother's funeral, the story wouldn't be about her cruelty. It would be about me, the emotional youngest son who couldn't behave. Across the aisle, I heard my father greeting Deacon Lewis. "Thank you for coming, sir," like he was hosting. Jody straightened up with a faint little smile, like she'd said a prayer. I kept my face still. I told myself, not here. Watch. Remember. Then the room changed. A small sound drifted out from the casket. Light, amused, unmistakable. A soft giggle like my mother had heard something foolish in the kitchen and couldn't help herself. The pastor stopped mid-sentence. A program slipped from someone's hand and slapped the floor. My father turned sharp, eyes locked on the coffin. Jody's color drained, her lips parted, but nothing came out. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there with my mother's silver teaspoon cold against my ribs, watching Jody stare at that coffin like it might answer her again. The last thing I remember before the murmurs began was the look on Jody's face when she realized that maybe my mother wasn't done speaking. The sound had been soft, but it moved through the room like a draft slipping under a closed door. People didn't say a word at first. They shifted. A few turned their heads toward the casket, then toward each other, as if waiting for someone else to explain what had just happened. I stayed where I was. My hands were still folded, but my attention sharpened. I had spent most of my life trying not to make waves. Now I was watching every detail. A man in the second row cleared his throat. A woman beside him adjusted her purse on her lap, though it was already perfectly placed. The pastor stood near the pulpit, holding his Bible open, but he wasn't reading. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge that something strange had just broken through a very controlled moment. My father finally stepped forward. His voice carried the same steady tone he used at community meetings. "Thank you all for being here," he said, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Margaret would be deeply grateful for your kindness." He spoke with calm authority, but I noticed his jaw was set tighter than before. His hands stayed close to his sides, fingers curling and uncurling like he was holding back something he couldn't quite name. Control mattered more to him than anything else in that moment. Jody had gone pale when the sound came from the casket. For a few seconds, she looked genuinely shaken. But that didn't last. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed the front of her dress, and composed herself. By the time my father finished speaking, she had regained her usual confidence. That told me something. She wasn't backing down. Whatever she believed she had secured in this family, she intended to hold on to it. The service resumed, though the atmosphere never quite returned to what it had been. Every prayer felt shorter. Every hymn sounded quieter. Even the closing remarks were brief, as if everyone wanted to move past the moment without giving it too much space. When the service ended, people filed slowly toward the reception hall next door. I followed along with the others, my steps measured, my mind unsettled. The silver teaspoon in my pocket pressed lightly against my ribs as I walked. I didn't take it out. I just let it stay there. A quiet reminder of the morning routines my mother never missed. The reception hall carried the familiar scent of coffee and baked casseroles. Volunteers from the church moved gently between tables, offering condolences and small plates of food. Politeness filled the room, but something underneath it had shifted. Conversations felt cautious, like everyone was choosing their words more carefully than usual. Jody moved through the crowd with ease, greeting people as though she had always belonged there. She placed her hand lightly on my father's arm, leaning in close when she spoke to guests. To anyone watching from a distance, she looked like a devoted partner, not an outsider. "Thank you for coming," she said to a couple from the choir. "It means so much to our family." The word "our" landed in my ears with a weight I couldn't ignore. I stood near the back of the room with a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking. From that spot, I could see everything. My father talking with the deacons, my sister standing beside Jody, nodding along to whatever she was saying, people offering quiet smiles, unsure where to direct their sympathy. Jody gathered with a small group of women near one of the long tables. They spoke softly, their heads close together. I didn't move closer, but I could still hear her voice carry just enough to reach me. "I'll make sure everything Margaret left behind is taken care of," she said. "She worked hard, and it deserves to be handled properly." She didn't speak like someone hoping to help. She spoke like someone already in charge. One of the women glanced toward me, then back at Jody, her expression careful. No one challenged the statement. No one asked questions. They simply accepted the words and let them settle into the room. That was when the realization began to take shape in my mind. The strange sound from the casket wasn't the only thing that had shifted that afternoon. The balance of power in my family had moved as well, and everyone could feel it, even if no one said it out loud. I set my coffee cup down on the nearest table, still untouched. The numbness I had been carrying all day started to change into something else. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't even grief anymore. It was awareness. For the first time, I wondered if my mother had seen this coming long before any of us did. As the reception wound down and people began gathering their coats, I realized that the faint sound from the casket was not the most unsettling part of the day. What unsettled me most was how quickly the space she left behind seemed to invite someone else to step into it. People hugged me on the way out like they were sending me off on a long trip. "Call if you need anything," they said, and I nodded because that's what you do in Savannah. You nod, you thank, you keep your face steady. In the parking lot, my sister climbed into her car without looking my way. My father stood with Jody near his sedan, talking low. She stayed close to him like she'd earned the right. When he glanced up and saw me, his expression didn't soften. It tightened, like he was already deciding what he would and wouldn't allow. I drove home with the radio off. The streets were damp from afternoon humidity, and the sky had that bruised purple-gray look it gets when evening settles in slow. At a red light, I took my hand off the wheel and felt the shape of the teaspoon through my jacket pocket. Cold metal. Familiar weight. Something small I could hold on to without explaining. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. Same porch light, same hydrangeas my mother insisted on trimming herself. But the air inside felt different the second I opened the door. Quiet, yes, but not the comfortable kind. It was the quiet of a room after the last guest leaves, like the walls were still listening. I hung my jacket on the back of a chair instead of the coat rack. Then I changed my mind, took it back, and kept it on. I wasn't ready to set anything down yet. Not even the little things. The kitchen clock ticked louder than it should have. I filled a glass with water, took one sip, and set it down by the sink. My eyes drifted toward the hallway before I could stop them. I should have gone to my own room. I should have sat on the edge of my bed and let the day drain out of me. But my feet took me toward hers, slow and certain, like they knew where they were headed. Her bedroom door was cracked open. Inside, everything looked exactly like Margaret had left it. The bed was made tight, corners tucked. Her reading glasses sat on the nightstand beside a worn paperback and a small dish she used for earrings. A faint scent of her lotion lingered in the air. Not strong, just enough to feel like a presence. That steadiness was what got me. My mother didn't leave things halfway done. She didn't forget. She didn't scatter. She prepared. I stepped closer and let my hand rest on the dresser for balance. My eyes moved across the surface. Hairbrush, a folded handkerchief, a small stack of church bulletins she meant to file. Then I saw her phone on the nightstand, screen dark. I told myself I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a number, a note, anything practical. That's how I tried to make it acceptable. The phone woke with a touch, no passcode. My mother never believed in locking the people she loved out of her life. I opened her messages without thinking too hard about it. Most were church reminders, family updates, neighbors checking in. Then I saw a draft, unsent. It was addressed to me. "Bryan," it began. "Baby, if you're reading this later, I need you to hear me plain." My throat tightened. She wrote about the way I carried things without asking for help, about how I watched and waited and took care of details nobody noticed. She said she saw it when others called it being quiet. She called it strength. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone who benefits from you staying small," she wrote. I sat down on the edge of her bed like my legs had decided for me. The room felt closer, warmer, like she was standing right behind my shoulder, guiding my eyes along the words. Halfway through, my vision blurred. Not from the kind of sobbing you do in a movie, just tears that show up when you aren't ready. At the bottom of the draft, she typed one more line. "Check my Bible." Not the living room one, the one I keep by the bed. I looked up at her nightstand. There it was, her Bible, worn at the corners, pages soft from decades of turning. She kept it within reach like other people keep a lamp. I lifted it carefully, like the weight of it mattered. When I opened the cover, an envelope slipped out and landed against the bedspread. My name was written on it in her neat, patient handwriting. For a moment, I just stared. My heart thumped slow and heavy, like it knew this wasn't only grief anymore. This was a message delivered on purpose. I slid my finger under the seal and opened it. Inside were papers folded with care, a letter on top. Beneath it, copies of documents with clean headings and neat notes in the margins. Trust, beneficiary, instructions. But it was the letter that held me still. "Bryan," she wrote, "I have watched people take what they didn't earn and smile while they do it. I won't let that happen to what I built, and I won't leave you unprotected." She didn't name Jody. She didn't have to. She wrote as if she'd already seen the way that woman stood too close, spoke too freely, reached for what wasn't hers. "Your father will want control," she wrote. "He will call it dignity. He will call it peace. But peace that costs you your voice isn't peace at all." My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of it. My mother had been planning, quietly, carefully, the way she always did, and she had chosen me to carry it forward. I set the papers back into the envelope exactly as I found them and held it against my chest. The sadness was still there, sitting in the background like a low hum. But something else had stepped in beside it. Clarity. I stood, walked back to the kitchen, and took my jacket off at last. The teaspoon slid into my palm when I reached into the pocket. I placed it on the counter next to my glass of water and looked at it for a long second. Silver doesn't shout, it just lasts. That night I understood what she meant. She hadn't left me unprepared. She'd left me the truth. After I set the teaspoon on the kitchen counter, I didn't touch it again. I left it right where it landed, beside the glass of water, like a marker on a map. Then I went back down the hall and returned to my mother's room. The envelope was still in my hands. I read her letter one more time, slower. Not because I was confused, but because I needed to hear her voice in my head, the way it used to sound across this house. Steady, practical, loving without making a show of it. I slid the papers back inside, sealed the flap, and laid the envelope on the nightstand. I didn't sleep much. I dozed in stretches, waking up with the same thought each time. Mom knew. By morning, the air outside felt clean in that early way Savannah sometimes surprises you. I showered, dressed plain, and made coffee I barely tasted. Before I left, I walked into the kitchen and looked at that teaspoon again. Silver doesn't shout, it just lasts. I didn't take it with me. I didn't need to. I had something else now. I picked up the envelope from the nightstand, tucked it into a folder, and carried it out like it was fragile glass. My father called around 8. His voice was clipped, like we were coordinating a business errand, not cleaning up the remains of my mother's life. "We're going to the bank," he said. 10 o'clock. Be there. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't mention the sound from the casket. He didn't mention Jody's whisper. The way my father handled discomfort was by acting like it never happened. "I'll be there," I said, and that was all. The bank branch sat off a main road, bright and calm, the kind of place designed to keep people from raising their voices. When I pulled in, my father's sedan was already parked near the front. Jody stood beside it, sunglasses on, hair set just right, holding a leather purse close to her side. She smiled when she saw me. Not a friendly smile, more like a reminder. "Morning, Bryan," she said. "I'm glad you came. It's important we all stay on the same page." My father stepped ahead of us, walking toward the door like he'd been there 1,000 times. He nodded at the guard. He nodded at the teller. That old community confidence sat on him like armor. At the counter, a young manager approached with a practiced expression. Her name tag said, "Miss Holloway." She spoke gently, the way people do in the South when they're about to deliver news someone won't like. "Mr. Peterson," she said, "I'm sorry for your loss. How can we help today?" My father straightened. "My wife's accounts. We need access. I'm her husband. I'm handling the arrangements." Jody stood close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his. She didn't say much, but her eyes tracked every movement on the manager's computer screen. "Ms. Holloway asked for identification and documentation." My father produced everything quickly, as if he'd prepared for this the way he prepared for any public moment. While she typed, Jody looked at me like she expected me to shrink into the background. I didn't. I stayed quiet, but I stayed present. Ms. Holloway paused at the screen. Not long, but long enough. Then she looked up, her tone still polite, still professional. "Mr. Peterson," she said, "the primary account you're requesting is restricted." My father's smile faded by a fraction. "Restricted how?" "It's held under a trust structure," she said. "That means access is controlled by the trust terms, not marital status." Jody's posture stiffened. "That doesn't make sense," she said, voice sweet but tight. "He's her husband." Ms. Holloway kept her eyes on my father. "I understand, but this was established by Mrs. Peterson. It's active and it's binding." My father leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if a softer tone could bend policy. "There must be a way to override it. We're family." "I can explain what I'm allowed to explain," Ms. Holloway said. "The trust requires specific authorization for any withdrawals or changes. Without that, the account remains frozen for general access." Frozen. That word hit the air like a door shutting. Jody's hand slid to my father's forearm. Not comforting. Claiming. "Scott," she murmured. "Tell her there's been a mistake." My father's face tightened. "Who has authorization?" he asked. Ms. Holloway's eyes flicked down to the screen again, then back up. "The successor trustee is listed," she said carefully, "but I can only discuss details with the parties named in the trust." My father's gaze moved toward me. It wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion, sudden and sharp, like a man realizing the room he thought he owned has another exit he didn't see. Jody followed his look, then looked at me with something colder than yesterday's smile. I could feel the folder in my hands, the envelope inside, my mother's handwriting waiting like a key. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. Ms. Holloway gave a small nod toward a side office. "If the named party is present," she said, "we can step somewhere private and review what the trust allows." My father didn't speak for a moment. The silence wasn't grief. It was calculation. Then he said through his teeth, "Fine." As we walked toward that office, I understood something simple and unshakable. My mother hadn't left a fortune behind. She'd left a fence around it. And for the first time in my life, my father didn't know how to climb over. We walked out of the bank in a tight little line, like a family in public and strangers underneath it. My father didn't speak until we reached the sidewalk. Jody stayed close to him, her heels clicking like punctuation, as if she could tap the situation back into her favor. In the parking lot, my father finally looked at me. "You didn't tell me you were involved," he said. I kept my voice even. "I didn't know what I was involved in until last night." Jody let out a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, come on. Let's not do this here. People can hear." My father's mouth tightened. "We'll talk at the house." He said it like he still owned the word. I watched them get into his sedan. Jody's hand lingered on his shoulder as she slid into the passenger seat, like she was reminding him who was supposed to be beside him now. Then they pulled out first, leaving me to follow. On the drive back, the streets looked ordinary. Spanish moss hanging low. A man washing his truck in a driveway. A school bus rolling by. The world kept moving, even when your own life feels rearranged. I tried to prepare myself for whatever came next. I told myself I had paperwork. I had my mother's instructions. I had facts. Facts were my language. I'd built my career on them. But grief doesn't argue like a spreadsheet. Grief waits until you're tired, and then it asks you who you are when nobody's clapping. When I turned onto my old street, the neighborhood looked the same as it always had. The oak in the yard still threw shade over the porch. The porch light blinked once, like it always did before it warmed up. For a half second, my body reacted the way it did when I was 10 and coming home with a report card, hoping my mother would be in the kitchen. I parked behind my father's car. Jody was already inside. I saw movement through the front window, curtains shifting. The house felt occupied, but not welcoming. I climbed the steps and put my key in the front door. It didn't turn. I tried again, slower, thinking maybe I was angled wrong. Still nothing. I pulled the key out and stared at it like it had betrayed me. Same ridges, same worn brass. The key my mother had handed me years ago with a simple, "Don't lose it." I leaned closer and realized the lock wasn't the same. The hardware looked newer, shinier. Someone had replaced it. My first instinct was to knock, like a guest. That hit me harder than the lock did. I knocked anyway. Not loud, controlled. The way you knock when you're trying to keep dignity from spilling. Footsteps approached. The door opened a few inches, chain still latched. My father stood there, face set, eyes tired but firm. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of the entryway. My mother's framed photo still hung on the wall, but it looked like it had been shifted. Slightly crooked, as if someone had bumped it and not cared enough to straighten it. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Why is the lock changed?" My father didn't answer right away. He glanced past me, down the street, as if he didn't want the neighbors to see his son standing on the porch like a stranger. "It's better this way for now," he said. "For who?" I asked. His eyes narrowed. "For everyone. Things are tense. You're upset. I'm upset. We need time." Time. That word people use when they don't want to say the real thing. I looked at him through the crack of the door. "Did you do this, or did she?" Jody's voice floated from somewhere behind him, sweet and sharp at the same time. "Scott, We don't need an argument on the porch. My father's jaw flexed. Bryan, don't make this harder. I almost laughed, but it wasn't funny. Harder than changing the locks on your son? His gaze flicked down, then back up. You have your own place. I did. I had an apartment across town. A quiet, practical space I paid for myself. But this wasn't about square footage. This was the house I learned to walk in. The house where my mother taught me how to tie a tie. The house where she stood at the same door and waved every time I drove back to school. My father kept his hand on the edge of the door, like he was holding a boundary in place. I need a few things, I said. Mom's papers, some of her personal items. We'll sort that out later, he replied, when everyone's calmer. I held his eyes. I am calm. His expression hardened, like calm was the wrong answer. Calm meant I wasn't easy to dismiss. Jody appeared behind him then, just enough for me to see her face over his shoulder. Her lips curved in a polite smile, meant for church, not family. Bryan, she said softly, we all loved your mother in our own way. Let's not turn this into something ugly. I stared at her. Her hour again, her claim wrapped in gentleness. My father shifted as if to close the door. Go home, he said. We'll talk soon. The door shut. The chain never came off. I stood there for a moment with my key in my hand, feeling something inside me loosen. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. A recognition. A grief with a new shape. I walked down the steps slowly, as if moving too fast might make it real. At my car, I paused and looked back at the porch. The light had steadied now, glowing warm like nothing had happened. In my mind, I heard my mother again. Silver doesn't shout. It just lasts. I didn't have the spoon with me. I didn't need it. The lesson was already in my bones. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb. As the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, I understood something I'd avoided my whole life. Losing a place isn't the same as losing who you are. I didn't go straight home after I pulled away from that porch. I drove past the river, past the little strip of shops my mother used to like, until the tightness in my chest eased enough for me to breathe normally. Then I went back to my apartment and sat in silence with my phone face down on the table, like I could keep the world away by not looking at it. For the next couple of days, I handled the practical pieces I could control. Calls, forms, a meeting with the funeral home to finalize what still needed signatures. I kept my mother's envelope in a folder at home, out of sight. It wasn't fear that made me do that. It was instinct. When people start acting entitled, they start reaching. By the end of the week, I found myself turning back onto my old street again. I told myself I was going for something simple. A sweater of hers, a photo I didn't want misplaced, maybe even just proof that the house hadn't fully turned against me. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray afternoon that makes every color look dull. I parked across the street this time, not behind my father's car. I wanted room to leave if I needed to. I walked up the steps and knocked. I didn't try my key. The lock was still new, the message still the same. Footsteps came. The door opened without the chain this time, but my father's body filled the doorway in a way that said the invitation stopped at the threshold. What do you want? He asked. I'm not here to argue, I said. I need a few of Mom's things, personal items. He looked past me, scanning the street, then stepped aside just enough for me to enter the foyer. Not a welcome, a concession. The house smelled different, not like my mother's cooking or her lotion. It smelled like lemon cleaner, sharp and artificial, like somebody had scrubbed the air. I didn't head toward the living room. I went straight down the hall. My mother's bedroom door was open. The room stopped me in place. The bed was stripped down to bare mattress. The nightstand was empty. No glasses, no Bible, no framed photo of her and my sister at graduation. The dresser top was wiped clean, like it had never held a brush or a bottle of perfume. Even the little rug by the bed was gone. It looked staged, neutral, disposable, like a hotel room after checkout. My hands fell to my sides. I stood in that doorway trying to make my brain accept what my eyes were showing me. This wasn't tidying up. This was erasure. Behind me, my father's voice came, controlled and impatient. We had to clear it. It was time. I turned slowly. Time for what? To pretend she didn't live here? He walked up beside me and glanced into the room like it was just a closet that needed reorganizing. Margaret wouldn't want the house stuck in mourning. She would tell you to move forward. My throat tightened. Don't speak for her like that. His eyes snapped to mine. I was her husband. And I was her son, I said. The one who actually listened when she talked. My father's face hardened, the same look he wore when I was a kid and corrected him in front of company. The look that warned me to fall back in line. You don't know what she wanted, he said. I almost answered with anger. I could feel it waiting, hot and quick. But I didn't give it air. I stepped into the room and looked at the bare nightstand, then at the clean wall where her favorite print used to hang. I let the silence do the speaking. My father followed, voice rising just enough to sound like authority instead of grief. We're not keeping a shrine. People need to live in this house. People, not family, not her. People. I turned to him. Where are her things? In storage, he said. Safe. The words sounded rehearsed, like a line he'd practiced. I'll decide what gets kept and what gets donated. I watched him carefully. Not for emotion, for cracks, for tells. He added, your sister agrees. She says dragging this out isn't healthy. There it was. The rewritten history. The new version where everyone was united, practical, reasonable. And I was the only one emotional. I nodded once, slowly. Mom didn't ask to be erased, I said. My father's eyes narrowed. You're making accusations. I'm naming what I see, I replied, and I'm not signing off on it. He took a step closer. You don't get to come in here and challenge me in my own house. I held his gaze. It was her house, too. His mouth opened, then closed. For a brief second, the certainty slipped. Then it returned, firmer. Bryan, he said, lowering his voice, you've always had a way of turning things into a problem. I didn't react the way the younger me would have. I didn't apologize. I didn't shrink. I said evenly, no. I've always had a way of noticing problems early. That's different. He stared at me, and I could feel the distance between us widen into something permanent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply didn't agree. And that refusal changed the air more than any shouting could have. I walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, and stopped in the foyer. My father followed, still talking like he could talk me back into silence. We're moving forward, and he said, that's the end of it. Ah, I looked at him once. You can move forward, I replied, but you're not moving forward by rewriting who she was. I stepped outside and let the door close behind me. The porch boards creaked under my feet the way they always had, like the house still remembered, even if the people inside wanted to forget. As I drove away, I knew the truth was no longer something I could carry quietly. It was something I would eventually have to defend. And I didn't sleep much the night after that visit. I kept replaying the look on my father's face when I refused to agree with his version of things. It wasn't just irritation. It was something closer to fear. 2 days later, the bank called to confirm a formal review meeting. My father had requested it. He wanted clarification. I knew what that meant. He wanted reversal. Late that morning, I parked outside the bank and sat in my car for a moment before going in. I wasn't bracing for a fight. I was steadying myself for the final shift. Inside, the branch was quiet. Polished floors, low voices. The manager greeted us and led us into a private conference room with a long table and glass walls that blurred the lobby beyond. My father sat at the head of the table without being asked. Jody took the chair beside him, posture straight, hands folded like she was in church. I chose a seat across from them, not confrontational, just direct. The manager began calmly. We're here to review the trust structure established by Mrs. Peterson. My father interrupted. I believe there has been an error in how this was executed. There it was. The tone he used when speaking to contractors who hadn't followed instructions. The manager didn't react. The documents were filed 6 months ago. They were notarized and reviewed by counsel. My father leaned forward. Margaret was under stress. She was ill. I'm questioning her capacity. Jody added gently, we just want to make sure everything was done properly, that's all. I watched them both, measured, calculating. The manager nodded. That's why Dr. Harris is joining us. The door opened quietly, and my mother's physician stepped in. He looked composed, almost apologetic, like he knew he was about to step into family tension. After brief greetings, he sat and folded his hands. Mrs. Peterson was evaluated at the time these documents were signed, he said. Her cognitive function was intact. She was clear about her decisions. My father's jaw tightened. She never discussed this with me. Dr. Harris met his gaze. She was very deliberate. That word hung in the room. My father shifted in his seat. Deliberate about cutting me out? The manager answered before the doctor could. Sir, you are not cut out. The trust allocates specific oversight responsibilities. My father turned toward me then. Did you know about this? I held his eyes. Not until after the funeral. That was the truth, and it was enough. He exhaled sharply. So she blindsided both of us. No, I said quietly. She prepared. The manager slid copies of the trust across the table. Paper against polished wood. Simple. Final. It cannot be dissolved without the trustee's consent, she explained. And the trustee is Bryan. The room grew still. Jody's composure flickered. That doesn't seem balanced, she said carefully. Scott was her husband. The manager replied in the same calm tone. Mrs. Peterson structured this intentionally. She wanted oversight independent of marital influence. Independent of marital influence. Even my father heard it. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a second as if calculating options. When he looked at me again, the authority in his expression was thinner. You're going to let a technicality tear this family apart? He asked. I didn't raise my voice. This isn't a technicality. It's what she wanted. He shook his head slowly. You've always been stubborn. I almost smiled. No, I've just learned to listen. Dr. Harris gathered his folder. Margaret spoke highly of you, he said to me. She trusted your judgment. My father looked away at that. There were no more arguments left that didn't sound desperate. The facts had done what I didn't need to. The meeting ended without anyone slamming a hand on the table. No shouting, just paperwork and restrained breaths. We walked out together, but not as a unit. My father stopped near the entrance. This isn't over, he said quietly. I nodded. I know. Jody stood beside him, her expression composed but strained. Families work things out, she said, one way or another. I looked at both of them and felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, clarity. I didn't need them to admit anything. I didn't need apologies. The structure was in place. The truth had witnesses. As I stepped outside into the late morning light, I understood something that had taken me years to grasp. Proving the facts was the easy part. Accepting what those facts revealed about the people you love, that was harder. We didn't speak in the parking lot after the meeting. My father walked ahead, Jody close behind him, like they were already regrouping. I stayed back a few steps, giving them space and giving myself time to absorb what had just happened. That evening, my father called and asked me to come to the house. We need to settle this privately, he said. His voice was controlled, almost careful. The sky had turned dark by the time I pulled into the driveway. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. The porch light was on. The living room lamp glowed through the front window, casting long shadows across the floor. When I stepped inside, the room was arranged like it used to be for serious conversations. Chairs angled inward. No television, no distractions. My father stood near the fireplace. Jody sat upright on the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. He didn't waste time. You've made your point at the bank, he said. Now let's talk like family. I stayed standing. I'm listening. His eyes sharpened. You've positioned yourself as the gatekeeper of your mother's money. People will talk. They'll think you pushed her into it. The accusation was smooth, strategic. I felt the sting, but I didn't react outwardly. That's not true. It's how it looks, he replied. You've always been good with numbers. Easy for people to assume you influenced her. Jody leaned forward slightly. We're just concerned about perception, Bryan. Reputations matter in this town. There it was. Not grief, not fairness. Reputation. I took a slow breath. If this is about image, then let's talk about the full picture. My father frowned. What does that mean? I reached into my folder and placed a single sheet of paper on the coffee table. It wasn't dramatic. It was factual. Public record. Jody's name. Bankruptcy filed years ago. Significant debt. Dismissed civil claims tied to unpaid business loans. I didn't say it with cruelty. I said it with clarity. This is part of the context. Jody's face drained of color. That was a difficult period of my life, she said quickly. People recover. I know, I replied. This isn't punishment, it's transparency. My father's voice rose. You went digging into her past? It's public record, I said, the same way the trust is. The air in the room tightened. Rain began tapping against the windows. You're trying to paint her as unstable, he snapped. No, I said calmly. I'm explaining why Mom might have structured things the way she did. Silence followed, not empty, charged. My father's shoulders sagged slightly, and his tone shifted. Fine, he said. Let's compromise. We divide the assets more evenly, quietly. No more meetings, no more outside involvement. A settlement offer. Jody nodded quickly. It keeps the peace. No one has to feel cut out. I felt the weight of it. If I agreed, the tension would ease. The neighbors wouldn't whisper. My father could save face. Jody would feel secure, and my mother's decision would become negotiable. I looked around the room, the same room where she hosted Thanksgiving dinners, where she once told me in a quiet voice that dignity mattered more than comfort. If I accepted this, it would look reasonable. It would also mean pretending she hadn't known exactly what she was doing. My father studied me. You don't want this dragging on, he said. Trust me. For a moment, I saw the man who taught me to ride a bike, the man who once clapped the loudest at my graduation, and I felt the ache of what this had become. Then I saw the cleared bedroom, the new locks, the rewritten story. I met his eyes. Mom did. That was all I said. Not loud, not angry, just true. The words landed heavier than any argument. My father's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Jody looked down at her hands. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof. My father finally sank into the armchair behind him. The fight seemed to drain out of his posture. Not defeated, just aware. You're willing to let this split the family, he said quietly. I shook my head. I'm not splitting anything. I'm honoring what she decided. The room settled into stillness. The offer was no longer on the table. The strategy had failed. After a while, I picked up my folder and moved toward the door. No one stopped me. As I stepped onto the porch, the storm had begun to pass. The air felt cooler. I understood then that winning wasn't about taking something from them. It was about refusing to surrender what had already been entrusted to me. The silence behind me wasn't peace, but it was clarity. When I pulled away from the porch the night before, I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. What I felt was quieter than that, like the air after a storm, when the trees are still dripping, but the wind has stopped arguing with itself. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and my mother's little silver teaspoon tucked in my jacket pocket, where it had lived since the funeral. At a red light, I held it between my fingers for a second. It was small, slightly worn, and stubbornly bright under the street lamp. Something meant to last. I slept a few hours, woke before sunrise, and made coffee I didn't really want. The house was silent, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as the one in my father's living room. This one didn't feel like a test. It felt like permission to breathe. By the time the sky started turning pale, I was back in the old neighborhood. The streets were empty. A sprinkler clicked somewhere down the block. Spanish moss hung from the oaks like it always had, and for a second I could almost pretend my mother would be in the kitchen, humming softly while she waited for the kettle to sing. I parked across from the house instead of in the driveway. I didn't want to announce myself. I just wanted to see it in the early light, when everything looks honest. I walked up the sidewalk slowly, noticing small things I'd ignored in all the tension. The crack in the front step, the rose bush she used to trim with careful hands, the worn patch on the porch rail where she'd leaned during long phone calls. Then I saw the mailbox. The nameplate was still there, polished metal. My father's chosen version of our family. It wasn't wrong exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth anymore. I stood there longer than I expected. Not because I was unsure, but because I was letting myself feel what it meant. The fight hadn't been about money. It had been about being erased, then being told I should be grateful for the erasure. I took out a small screwdriver I'd brought from my car. Simple, practical. The kind of tool my mother always said belonged in a glove compartment. As I loosened the screws, I heard a door open down the street. Someone's dog barked once. Ordinary morning sounds. Life continuing, indifferent and steady. The old nameplate came off in my hands. For a moment, I almost put it back. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The habit of keeping things smooth, keeping things quiet, keeping other people comfortable. I didn't. From my jacket pocket, I pulled a new plate I'd ordered overnight from a local shop that did engravings. It wasn't fancy, just clean lettering, the kind you can read at a glance. My mother's maiden name, the name she carried with pride before she ever learned to swallow her opinions for the sake of peace. I set it in place and tightened the screws until it was secure. Then I stepped back. The change was small, almost laughably simple, a few inches of metal on a mailbox, but it did something to my chest that the bank meeting never could. It reminded me that identity isn't something you beg to keep. It's something you choose to protect. I touched the teaspoon again, almost without thinking, and I finally understood what she meant all those mornings at the kitchen table. Silver doesn't shout, it just lasts. My father might never apologize. He might go on telling his own version of the story to whoever will listen. Jody might find another way to attach herself to someone else's stability. None of that was mine to manage anymore. I looked at the house one last time, not with bitterness, but with a kind of steady acceptance. Some families don't break with explosions. They break with decisions made in quiet rooms. And sometimes healing starts the same way. I turned and walked back to my car. The neighborhood stayed calm behind me. The new nameplate caught the morning light for a moment, then settled into place like it had always belonged there.